Hello everybody, welcome to our first online class. I'm going to give you an abbreviated version of my lecture, and hopefully we'll be able to fill in the gaps in our discussion and with your readings. Food has always been important to, organisms, and it's no less important to people. Our earliest ancestors, the first hominids, started leaving forested areas and moving into savannas, and it drove us to become bipedal. So our bipedal version of the primate order was established by the quest for food under new environmental circumstances. And this quest for food has not stopped. We're still affected by our trying to find food. I mean, look at what's going on this week and the pressure on the grocery stores as people are worried about their food supply. Okay, this entire lecture is going to be about subsistence patterns. Next week is also going to be about subsistence patterns. And the easy way of describing this is just how a society gets its food. There's 4 basic subsistence patterns. The foragers, which are also called hunter-gatherers, they don't produce any of their own food. They collect it, or they gather it. Genius, huh? Then there's horticulturalists, which are a very basic form of planting. They use digging sticks, machetes, simple tools, human labor. They don't use plows, they don't use animal power. It's very simple plant production. Pastoralists are herdsmen. They use animals as their primary food source. And then there's agriculturalists, which is what we're the most familiar with. These are people who use plows and ox or horses to grow their food. It's characteristic of state-level societies in which part of their product goes to either pay for land or pay taxes. This is food production that creates a large surplus for others. Okay, so as I said, food continues to play an important role in shaping our historic events. For example, there was the Irish potato famine. This was in the 1840s. And it was only a famine in that many Irish people starved to death because of this. And you're asking, why would they have starved to death if it only attacked the potatoes? Because it was a fungus or bacteria that killed the potatoes in the ground. But there was plenty of food. They grew grains, they grew fruit, they had other kinds of food. Well, funny you should mention that. The English landowners were shipping out the other types of food under armed guards to pay for the rent. So anyone who was caught stealing this food was killed or arrested and exiled. So during the 1840s, Ireland lost half its population to either transportation, which is them being sent away into exile, or leaving willingly, going to Australia, America, Canada, or of course those that starved. So the Irish potato famine had these big repercussions because it changed the politics in New York and Boston and Australia because of all these immigrants, and these immigrants were voting on the Democratic ticket in these places because you didn't have to be a naturalized citizen to vote back then. So think about how much this fungus on this potato changed the entire system in America. And in around the 1930s, 40s, give or take, the Cold War had its own interesting byproduct. Depression-era Soviet plant geneticists decided they were going to use Lamarckian evolution. Lamarck thought that features acquired while an organism was alive, would be passed on to its offspring. So if an animal stretched its neck really far to eat the leaves and kept doing it, its neck would get a little bit longer. And Lamarck believed that this kind of trait could be passed down so that organism's offspring would have a longer neck. This goes completely counter to everything we know about evolution under the Darwinian principles. But the Minister of Agriculture in Russia was named Lysenko, and he said this was completely not socialist, this was not communist, that the survival of the fittest happened. He thought Lamarck's ideas was more in keeping with communist philosophy. So he had the ear of Joseph Stalin, and they started having all the scientists arrested that were saying, no, Darwinian evolution is true and Lamarckian evolution isn't. And this set back Soviet agriculture decades. And so people started starving because they were taking summer wheat and they were freezing these seeds, and they would plant them and they'd take those seeds and freeze them again, and they were thinking that freezing all these seeds would create winter wheat because of the inherited characteristics. It failed. Crops weren't thriving because they were trying to plant summer wheat in winter environments. But luckily, Lysenkoism's gone, and people always now listen to the scientists instead of politicians. Yeah, right. Okay, moving on. And the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. This was a man-made disaster. Okay, it wasn't entirely man-made because we had a really bad drought and a very hot series of summers, but scientists in America had been saying you can't keep ripping up the Kansas and Oklahoma grasses and just planting this wheat. It doesn't have the root structure to hold in the soil. There's going to be problems. And the scientists had come up with ways to make sure that this wheat was planted in a way that was better for that environment. And people weren't listening, and we had this complete disaster where the breadbasket of America, a number of states just north of Texas, they couldn't plant. There was dust storms, and if you look at this documentary, this 5-minute trailer for the documentary, it explains what was happening. It's pretty horrible. But we learned from that and listen to scientists now, right? So moving on to subsistence patterns. Food collecting and food producing are not mutually exclusive. Most societies practice more than one technique, and most have one main subsistence pattern supplying the majority of their diet. So thinking about us, the majority of our diet comes from corn and wheat. Think tortilla chips and bread. Not in that order. But some people will go fishing, others hunt. So even in a pastoralist community, most of their food comes from their animals in the form of milks, cheeses, but they'll plant gardens sometimes or have orchards, depending on the environment. Okay, and when we're talking about hunting gathering, I need to preface this. The hunting theme has been overemphasized by anthropologists as a result of sexism and due to the foragers' own emphasis. So we have to be more objective in our observations, and we're seeing new things. So when anthropologists first went into the field to study hunter-gatherers, who were the anthropologists? That's right, men. And who are they going to talk to? Yep, that's right, other men. So 75% of a lot of hunter-gatherer societies' diets are based on plant gathering. But the women gather the food, so the men talking to other men are only going to hear about food collection from the hunters. And also, even if the men were gathering more plants than they generally do, because they do also gather plants too, what are they going to talk about? What's more exciting, the 3 days that they followed a zebra trying to catch it, or that they collected a lot of mapango nuts that day? So they're going to talk about the zebra. So we have a skewed perspective, and we have to keep that in mind. Okay. So even before we became fully anatomically modern humans, even before we became kind of anatomically modern humans, our genus, the Homo line, were scavenging food. And they started developing tools to cut through the hide, to cut the meat, and they also started making hammers to break the bones to get out the really fatty marrow. And as they ate more meat, it started adding to the size of their brains, which started making them better at tool use, which of course helped with the dexterity of their hands, started expanding their brains, so they started getting better at making tools, which started making their brains bigger and started adding to the dexterity of their hands, and you see the cycle happening. So adding meat to our diets was very critical to our development as the genus Homo and what we became as humans. Okay, and as our ancestors left Africa, they started experiencing colder weather. Go figure. Europe's a lot colder than sub-Saharan Africa for the most part. And they were there during the Ice Age. So they couldn't plant food. They had a harder time finding vegetables. So they were more reliant on meat and, of course, the skins from the animals. So hunting became even more important. And we can see this in the archaeological artifacts. If you look at this, see that skeleton down in the corner? That's a mastodon. And this is a spear thrower. It's actually part of a set called an atlatl. So the notch of the spear will go onto this tail, and it's used as a lever, like a fulcrum, and it gives you a lot more power to throw this spear, which was able to pierce hides and go much further. You can look up atlatl throwing online, and it'll show you how much stronger it is, a spear throw is with this device. And you can see that they were becoming very artistic. So this spear thrower is shaped like the animal that they were trying to hunt. Okay, so as I said, hunting took on an increasingly important role as the Europeans encountered the Ice Age and the cold winters. Specialized hunting tools developed, like I just showed you, and early cave art reflected hunting as a theme. This is the La Chapelle caves in France. People can't go into these anymore because the moisture from human breaths were starting to break down the cave paintings, but they made a replica right next to it that people could go in and get the same experience, so that's kind of neat. And I'm going to be harping a lot on foragers for a really good reason. Learning about foragers is important because this is the human subsistence pattern. Anatomically modern humans have been foragers for 96% of our time on Earth. So, a couple 100,000 years, we were hunter-gatherers. We've only had agriculture 12,000, 10,000 years, hundreds of thousands of years. Or if you go back to our earliest ancestors 2 million years ago, or even before that 4 million years ago with Australopithecus, they were hunter-gatherers. Well, less hunter in our earliest phases, but they were gatherers. So why is this important? Why does it affect us now? It affects us now because think about when you're really, really tired, hungry, you're not going to have a chance to get a meal, so you go into a store like 7-Eleven and you grab a snack. What do you go for? Yes, everybody here said carrots and celery. Sure, I'm proud of you. Now, for the most part, you're going to grab ice cream or potato chips, pork rinds. And why do you grab these snacks that you grab? because these are what your body craves. Because we've adapted to need, well, we haven't adapted to need it, but we've adapted to want the things we need, which is salt. If you don't have enough salt in your diet, you could die. Your cells don't function, your brain's not going to work, you need salt, which seems pathological now because we have so much salt that it's killing us. But the same thing with the fat. Our body needs fat. We have to have a certain amount of fat in our diet, and it helps us pack on a little bit more storage for the lean times. And of course, sweet. Our ancient ancestors knew that if we found a bright red fruit tree with all these beautiful ripe fruits, they weren't going to last very long. So our ancestors would eat all the fruit on that tree because that's the only time they're going to be able to get it. Our bodies adapted to millions of years of having these shortages, craves and wants all these all the time, because it doesn't know that we have grocery stores that mean we could have it all the time now, usually. So our bodies aren't adapted for this grocery store and constant food. So just keep that in mind when we're talking about foragers. This is how we adapted. Okay, so foraging is also another name for hunting and gathering, and it relies on naturally occurring sources of food. Hunter-gatherers do not grow food. They'll know where the trees are that produce certain fruit. They'll know where to find certain berries, and they'll throw the seeds in the same area, so there'll be more berries the next year. But they don't purposely grow their own food. Hunter-gatherers live in bands. This is societies that move from place to place in search of resources or in response to seasonal fluctuations. They're individual units of a foraging society, so the society has many bands in it, but each band is its own autonomous group of related nuclear families. So bands are flexible. So the video I sent to you guys, there's 4 brothers and their wives and their children. Say one of those groups of one of those families, one of the brothers or his wife, there's this, I'm sick of this group, I don't want to deal with them anymore. Next time all the bands get together, because they get together for a lot of festivities, like you see in the Eating Christmas reading. The families get together, they have big celebrations, they meet potential spouses. They could just go off and live with either the wife's family or other people that they're related to, their grandmother's family. So the membership is flexible. See this totem pole here? This is from a Pacific Northwest group called the Quiehoodle. And they are a very special group in that they are able to have a forager society that's complex with a lot of social stratification. They're very different than most hunter-gatherer societies because they live somewhere where there was so much food, they didn't have to move very much, and they didn't have to form agriculture. So they're one of the few complex societies that didn't have to become food producers. See in this slide, you can see a couple more of their totem poles. And the native Floridians, the Tequesta, were also a stratified, advanced, complex society that didn't have to produce their own food. But in all hunter-gatherer societies, food distribution is distributed along kinship lines. So there's not someone that gets more. Everybody gets the same amount of food. Well, children, of course, are going to get less, but everybody gets what they need. It's not a situation where the most important members get the most food. Group size varies with availability of food resources, so the Quiehoodle have a lot of people, whereas the Kungsan people in the video, the Bushmen, they had very few people. They keep their bands at about 30. And we'll talk about the Quiehoodle and their food distribution in next week's lecture. Hunter-gatherers tend to be nomadic. This refers to societies that move from place to place in search of resources or in response to seasonal fluctuations. Those that live in environmentally stable areas without seasonal fluctuation, they don't move as much. They tend to follow water sources. So if it starts to dry up in one area, they'll move to their more stable watering areas that they save towards the end of the dry season. So those in the northern areas, they'll follow around animal herds, or they'll go to places where it's more climatically hospitable. So here is a Cheyenne family, and this contraption on the back of her horse is called a travois. So it's kind of like a sled that they're able to pack up their stuff and move around. People who live around the Arctic Circle or up north have to move around a lot more than someone in sub-Saharan Africa because they have to follow these animals. They think that this is how the Americas got peopled. Those that were living in Northern Asia were following animal herds, and over many generations they were able to follow these animal herds as they walked over the Bering Land Bridge to the area that's now Alaska and then down through the Americas. Okay, hunter-gatherers are egalitarian. So there's equal distribution of objects, of food, of everything among the members. There is a division of labor based on sex, but beyond this, there's no labor specialization. So there is a shaman in every group that is called upon by the spirits, but that's about it. The leadership is usually either the eldest or the one that has the best ideas, and if that person's ideas stop being great, they will listen to someone else. There's no ownership of land or resources. And back to the video I'm showing you, that's the Kung or the Kungsan, also called the Bushman. There's two characteristics that are very important to foraging societies. One, I already mentioned, their lack of formalized wealth and status differences. Remember when we were reading Eating Christmas in the Kalahari? That teasing to make sure nobody got too arrogant, because someone will always run faster or be able to throw like a hunting weapon better than the others. So that teasing keeps people from becoming big-headed. It minimizes those differences. So there's no social stratification. And their religion also lacks this stratification. They're polytheistic in that they recognize multiple supernatural beings, but the supernatural world is pretty egalitarian. The river is a spirit, the sun is a spirit, the rain has its own spirit, so do the animals and the humans. And nothing is more important. Some can be more deadly than others, others are more tricky than others, but the supernatural world doesn't have that hierarchy that we think of when we think of polytheistic religions, like the Greeks and Romans. Those are highly stratified. They're hierarchical polytheistic religions, whereas the hunter-gatherers, they don't have that hierarchy. So egalitarian means that there's no formally recognized status differences. The social order and physical welfare of hunter-gatherers would suffer otherwise. If someone thought that they should have more food than the others, people in the community could starve very quickly. Okay, this just says again what I mentioned before. Common worldviews of hunter-gatherers see their environment as predictable but unstable. As a result, they recognize multiple supernatural beings with more or less equal power over the material world. I already said this. Individual foraging units are bands, nuclear families. So they practice this thing called generalized reciprocity. Everybody shares with each other, everybody trusts that everybody else in their band will provide for them if they're in need, so they they freely share like we do within our families, as opposed to in our society we use something called balanced reciprocity, where if I do a favor for you, I expect a favor in return, and vice versa. Imagine getting a gift from someone. You brought them a coffee mug full of cocoa mix, and they bought you an expensive one. You would feel really bad because of balanced reciprocity. They practice generalized family reciprocity in their communities. Okay, I mentioned also before, and I want to stress this, there is a division of labor. Usually it's based on gender. A lot of times it's based on age. So in some societies, women make the fishing nets. Other societies, men will make the fishing nets. Or I'm going to show you a group in next week's video, a horticultural group. The older men are the ones that make the baskets because older men have the gift of patience, where in other societies, women make the baskets. So women and men's work is completely and utterly cultural. All cultures have gender-based division of labor. What those labors are is cultural. Folk taxonomy, write that word down, keep it in your heads. Folk taxonomy. Division of labor and men and women's work is folk taxonomy. Okay, marriage patterns are based on subsistence patterns. Hunter-gatherers and advanced agriculturalists tend to practice monogamy, in which a man and a woman pair off. Horticulturalists and pastoralists in general are polygynous. A man will marry multiple wives. There are groups that are polyandrous, in which the woman will have more than one husband, but those are much fewer, and we'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. But remember, foragers are monogamous. We're monogamous in agricultural communities. Simple agriculture, horticulture, pastoralists, polygynous in general. And the reason I'm bringing up monogamy now for the foragers is that they have to make sure that there's not a surplus of children. Having a lot of wives means having a lot of children. They have to keep their populations very small because of environmental limitations. Most hunter-gatherer bands, you don't want more than 30 people. So if there's too many people, the land can't support that many people. So hunter-gatherers will limit their birth rates. And they try to keep it to one child once every 4 years. And they go out of their way to keep this 3 to 4 year birth spacing. Luckily, there's this really awesome thing with the human body called lactational amenorrhea. So prolonged nursing, if a woman nurses basically every 2 hours, 24 hours a day for 4 years, it turns off the menstrual cycle. The woman doesn't ovulate, so she can't get pregnant if she's not ovulating. But because this is so important, they also have a postpartum sex taboo, in which there's a period where the couple will not have sex in order to make sure there's no children. Of course, if that doesn't work, all cultures going back prehistorically have induced abortion if a woman does become pregnant too soon. There's herbs, there's different physical methods of inducing abortion, and if that doesn't work, the elders of the village will take away the baby and kill it, or they'll leave it out to the elements, because if a woman has 2 breastfeeding babies, or babies too close together, both babies could die, or it could be too much of a strain on the mother, and she could die too, and of course both the babies would die. So this birth spacing is critical. So postpartum sex taboo is prohibiting of sex for a certain period of time to limit birth rate, and infanticide, killing of infants, because it could cause starvation. So this is the better way, not perfect, but better than more people starving to death. Moving on from the hunter-gatherers, the transition to food production came about kind of gradually. Evidence for this transition we find in artifacts, so we can see the change in tools. Hunter-gatherers didn't have size and things to cut grain with, so we can see this. We can see mortar and pestles developing, and we can see plant and animal domestication in the archaeological record. A wild sheep looks very, very different than domesticated ones. There's changes in their bone structure, changes in size. The same thing with all domesticated animals. Think of the difference between a wolf and a chihuahua. You can see a lot of difference going on there. So, I don't like this question, but the real question from an evolutionary perspective is not how, but why there was a switch to food production. As people were wandering around, they were throwing plants down, and they'd go back to get them. I mean, it's pretty self-explanatory that having more food meant that that group could survive and pass on their genes more than people who weren't creating their own food. So, of course, there would be a move to food production. Might not have been the best move we made, but that's the lecture for next week. Well, I like ice cream, so yay, hooray, food production. Okay, one explanation is a retreat of the Pleistocene ice sheets. Intensive foraging was allowed during this climactic shift. There was more arable land, and the land that they were living in was better for planting. So that could be part of that transition. So, as I said, we're done with foragers. We're going to be talking about horticulturalists, pastoralists, and agriculturalists. These next few slides are all about pastoralists, and they're the ones in that video I showed you. And we'll deal with horticulture and agriculture, the plant-producing groups, next week. So here's a view of the different types of domestication. You can see most places started domesticating dogs first. They were easy to domesticate, and they kind of wanted to. Of course, some places do and did use them as food sources, but that doesn't change the fact that dogs are easily domesticated. And see sheep, cows. So pastoralism seemed to be more natural for us, easier for us to transition into than actually planting crops. Southwest Asia was the first place that really got into agriculture. Southwest Asia being the areas around the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. We call it the Middle East, but it's only middle if you're thinking Britain's the center of the world and China's the Far East, so everything over in this middle part is the Middle East. So Southwest Asia is more correct. Okay, as we start planting and having semi-permanent areas to live in, we start to develop ownership of things, which causes a social stratification, which is the presence of acknowledged differences in social status, political influence, and wealth among people within a society. And of course, once you get wealth and these status differences, you'll have different kinds of jobs. Some people have to be kings or emperors or queens, and then there's people that have to be priests and then artists, and that labor specialization becomes formalized. In our society, we have intense labor specialization, so some farmers have never been to the big cities. Some lawyers have never stepped foot on a farm. That is complete and utter labor specialization. Whereas in foraging communities, in horticultural communities, there isn't really labor specialization. Everybody does the tasks that are needed. Okay, improved ability to find food and deal with environmental pressures leads to population increase and a need to use knowledge of plants and animals to gain more control over their environment. And as they gained this control, they became better at it, which meant that they did more of it. So whatever the reasons, food production started spreading rapidly. And of course, more specialized knowledge. These are elderberries, by the way. Okay, pastoralism, the subsistence pattern characterized by an emphasis on herding animals. This subsistence pattern is based on herding, but they also hunt, they also gather, they sometimes farm. But remember, the mainstay of their diet is animal foods. These are Tibetan yak herders, and many of them don't eat meat. So they rely on butter, milk produced from these yak. Of course, if a yak falls off a cliff, they won't waste the meat. But for the most part, the majority of their diet, and only at celebrations or certain events, will they eat the meat of these animals. Okay, moving on. Most pastoralists are nomadic and egalitarian with use of pasture land and territory with other populations, so they'll guard their own special area. There's social stratification. There'll be a leader, but that leader is dependent on how many animals he owns. So in the next year, the big man could switch to this other guy because his cows had more babies. So leadership is flexible and temporary. There's sexual division of labor. Men usually care for the animals. Of course, the video I showed you, the young women are caring for the goats. So while men tend to care for the animals, that's flexible. Pastoralist religion tends to be based on ancestor worship. So their world is populated by the spirits of their dead. And imagine that the spirits of your grandfather and your great-grandfather and his great-grandfather are there with you, judging all your decisions that could cause misfortune if you don't do the right thing. There's going to be a lot of cultural conservatism in these groups if your ancestors are there judging everything you do. So they tend to adopt cultural change very slowly. Pastoralists live in areas where planting just isn't really an option. You can't be a hunter-gatherer in these areas because food doesn't grow very well for us. You can't till the soil and plant stuff because the land's really not good. It would need too much irrigation. It's not a good place for growing. So cows, camels, llamas, they're able to eat the grasses and leaves that humans can't digest. And they can convert this inedible stuff for us into portable food on the hoof. So pastoralists live in areas that other people don't want to live in. So your important points from this lecture. Food acquisition, the subsistence pattern used by a community, has been a driving factor in biological and cultural evolution. Humans have been foragers for most of their time on Earth, but about 12,000 years ago, this began to change drastically in multiple locations. There are many ways in which humans produce food: horticultural, pastoralism, and agriculture, and industrialism, and various combinations of all of those. These subsistence methods lead to changes in technology and cultural behaviors. Thank you, and next week, agriculture and horticulture. Take care of yourselves and be safe.